Good morning. This is Jason Dean coming at you. It's about um, noon, 10 after noon on a Monday, Martin Luther King Day, so it's a holiday. So, yeah, this weather that we're having here in Mid Coast is just god awful. The It's just been raining all weekend, mixed in with hail and a little bit of snow. But then it's been warm, and then it gets cold, and then after it rains, by the time nightfall comes, it seems to freeze, and it's almost like a ice storm kind of predicament. It's nasty, nasty, nasty out. So lots of things were canceled this weekend. I was going to go see today. A buddy of mine was going to be playing a gig at the Camden Snowball, and that's the Camden Snowball is a place where people all go skiing during the winter. And the weather is so bad that they canceled the snowball today. They closed the snowball, which is crazy. I mean, here we are in the middle of January in 2023. Usually, under somewhat normal circumstances, it's snowing. We by this point or by this time, we've accumulated lots of snow here in New England and in Maine. And so the ski resorts and what have you are all packed with people, and people are doing their thing and enjoying the snow. And here it is, it's so severe out where it's not really snow, it's just ice, that everything is, it's dangerous. It's dangerous to, I was going to go out to a show the other night with a buddy of mine. We were going to go to this punk rock show up in Bangor, and it was probably half hour or so before he was going to leave. He he was going to come to my house. We were going to carpool. He fell off his deck, slipped right off his deck, and landed right on his butt. Hurt himself pretty bad. And before that, I was looking at the forecast and realizing, wow, it's raining out. It's getting colder. I was getting a little bit nervous. So we ended up canceling, and that was the other night, Saturday. And then yesterday, the same thing happened. It warmed up in the morning. I had a day of where I taught, usually Sundays I teach a lesson or lessons. Taught my lesson in the morning, and then I had some friends over. We did a little bit of a jam session, but I had plans later that night, and it was weird because it was literally the same exact time that I was going to go out the preceding night, the night before. But and I was going to have another friend come over, and we were going to work on some music stuff and jam a little bit later yesterday evening. But it froze over, and it just started to rain, and it just got really treacherous out, and it continues to do that right now. Just crazy, crazy weather. Not at all what you would expect for wintertime, but it is what it is. So that being said, I'm not a weatherman by other by any means. So here to talk about movies. So today's show, being that yesterday, and again, I want to thank everybody for checking out the videos. We reached had a couple more videos that I put up within the last few days that just got into the thousands range. I really appreciate people checking out these videos. And again, I'm always surprised because it's always the movies that I cover that are probably the most obscure of the bunch that get the most coverage. It's fascinating to me, and it's also very inspiring for me to know that okay, there's a few folks out there that actually care about the crap I talk about. So it's very cool. And again, I just try to format this show to keep it real casual. I have tried to keep a certain structure to what I'm going to talk about, but at the same time, I try to keep it real casual and real loose. So, and I know in the past I might have crossed over and gotten away from the subject, so I'm always trying to kind of reel things in. But yesterday I did a show on the movie Smile that came out in 2022. Just came out I believe like a few weeks ago on DVD and Blu-ray. Again, I don't get to see a lot of newer films because of the streaming situation, and but that's okay. I don't really enjoy watching films in that format. There are certain films. There's been a couple of films that I've kind of broke down and ended up watching them streaming. I have a pretty decent laptop and I have some headphones and I'll watch the movie knowing that it's probably there's two movies that I know of that are probably never going to get a DVD release or a Blu-ray release. And recently, one which I was shocked and so surprised, the new Predator movie, Prey. I just saw an article about that. And I've heard across the board that it's a really good movie, and I really, really want to see it. I heard recently that that film and the company that put that film out has no intentions on putting it out on Blu-ray or DVD, which I just think is completely nuts. And again, it's a sign of the times that we're in. So that film right now is only available to stream, and it's going to be set in that format as of now permanently. So that's the only way. So I will probably have to break down. I will break down and probably pay for it online and watch it in a kind of crappy format. But that's what you got to do. And then another film that I saw last year, which I felt was so under the radar, but very interesting and very, very original in a lot of ways, was The Empty Man. Totally obscure movie. Had a big budget, and but it just bombed. It didn't. It wasn't even released by the theater, by the company that had produced it. It was basically after the film was finished. The studio executives, I guess, more or less decided it was not going to find an audience, so they just basically shelved it. And I kept hearing about it, and then I eventually saw it, and you can only get it online, and it's actually a really cool movie. It's actually a very interesting movie, and really different than what you would expect. But again, it's a crime that movie will never, as of now, it could change, and hopefully it will. But as of now, there's no plans to release that film, The Empty Man, on Blu-ray or DVD, which I just think is crazy and ludicrous. And the biggest surprise is Prey, because that movie was a very popular movie. It made quite a bit of money, and it was never released in the theaters. I've heard lots of people talking about it. I do love the character of Predator. The first one with Schwarzenegger is one of my all-time favorite action sci-fi horror movies. I think it's just such an awesome movie. The second one is pretty decent. Alien vs Predator, pretty good movies. The rest of that franchise, in particular the Predator franchise, not a huge fan. The last one that came out was really kind of unwatchable. But I love the character, and I heard that this one was a really great take. It was a return to form. It was really stripped down. It was kind of done in this kind of primitive environment. And I've heard from a lot of folks that it's really good. But so we'll see. We'll see. I probably will have to see it on YouTube or something, or some kind of streaming platform. But yesterday's show was all centered on Smile, which came out last year, 2022. It was just released on Blu-ray. That was a movie that was really, really talked about. It made a lot of top 10 lists from what I had seen, in the YouTube universe, as far as one of the best horror films that had come out. And I did a show on that, and I basically said, without reviewing that film, I basically said in a nutshell, the direction, the cinematography, the way it was shot, basically from a technical side, and also with a lot of the characters, the characterizations, the actors that were used. Pretty high quality movie. Kind of a more, to a degree, a commercially made Hollywood horror film. But I thought it had an edge to it. It was more graphic and more violent than I thought. but I thought it was overall pretty good. But I did have some significant problems with it, which I felt didn't really do it for me. As far as after I saw it, I let it kind of sit with me for a while, and I was like, okay, you know, sometimes you have to do that, and I find I have to do that sometimes where I'll have a different perspective on a movie after I've seen it. Sometimes right away, and you have this like reaction, but then there's times where it's like I don't know. One big example of that happening for me where I had pretty much an about face reaction to it was Terrifier with Art the Clown. Terrifier and Terrifier 2 especially has been kind of this phenomenon lately in the indie horror world, which on one hand it's a pretty inspirational story where these directors that or essentially these guerrilla filmmakers made this movie for virtually no money, and it's made and it, pertaining mostly to Terrifier 2, it was a commercially successful movie, and it made a lot of money in the box office, and considering it was so low budget. But I had that experience with Terrifier where I saw it, the first one. I haven't seen the second one, but I saw the first one, and I was I was into it for the most part. I felt the character of Art the Clown was legitimately creepy and terrifying. I thought the kills in the film were so incredibly over the top and 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 incredibly gory. That part of it I was really blown away by, and I was into it. I was into it. But then outside of those things, I wasn't sure what to really think of it. So, and a lot of times when I see new movies, newer horror films or new films in general, when I try to do a show on them, I usually do typically I'll do a show on that film the day after or the day of. So the film is still fresh, in my brain, and I'll let it, but I'll try to let it resonate with me. So I like, if I find myself thinking about it more, or maybe finding things about it after thinking about it that I really like, or it could have the reverse effect where I kind of forget about it and I'm not talking about it or I'm not discussing it. Especially if it's a film that I've gone to the theater and I've seen it with friends or whatnot, and I base a lot of my opinions on just that gut reaction. If you go to see a film in the theater in your and by the time the credits come up and you're jazzed up about it and you're excited about it and you're talking about it, with your friends right away, and then you go out, say, for food or some drinks afterwards, which is usually a thing that happens, and you're still talking about it. And then maybe the next day or the next week when you see that person, you're talking about it, or it comes up in conversation and it comes up about that movie. That's usually a pretty good indication that the movie has probably made an impact on you and is pretty good, because it makes you think, it makes you, talk about it, it gets you excited. It feels like it gives you the impression, okay, I had a good experience. And then there's times where you'll initially talk about it and have, some difference of opinion on how the film is, and maybe the next day, after it's been sitting with you, you suddenly have a totally different opinion, and you're kind of forgetting about it. You're not talking about it. You're not buzzed, and you're not buzzed on the idea of seeing this film or your experience. So I kind of base a lot of my opinions and my reviews. I try not to do. To me, it's not an intellectual thing. I think of it as just like a gut reaction, like how you react, you know. And a lot of the times, I find it can be wrong, and that meter can be off. But a lot of the times, I feel, for the most part, about 90, 95% of the time, your first reaction to something new, or say it's the first time you hear an album by a band you've heard a lot about, or maybe it's a band that you really love and they put out a new album, or same thing for a film. You might see a film for the first time by a first time director that you've never seen, or a film by a director that that you love but you had never seen that film, or they put out a new film. Most of the time I feel like your reaction that you get when you first experience it is probably what will prevail in the long scheme of things on your immediate thoughts and your gut reaction, the way even how your body reacts. So there are cases of where it switches back. But in the case of Terrifier, I liked it. I enjoyed the gore mostly. But the next day, I had this weird experience where I still thought about those aspects, but I kind of felt like I kind of used the example of like when you go and you go to like an amusement park and you buy a bunch of cotton candy, or you buy a bunch of like crappy food at the concession stands, a lot of fried, crap or whatever that you might not normally eat, but it's like a treat and it's delicious, and you smell it all around you, and then you eat it, and it's like it's very comforting and delicious. But then the next day you're like, you never want to see it again, or you never want to eat it again, and you might even feel like crap, or you're just like, I that was probably not the best thing to do. And when the next day after I had seen Terrifier, I had that kind of experience. Suddenly, I was like, it came to me as this idea of like, well, if you took out the copious amounts of gore, and the gore for that film is so over the top, I felt, well, all of the other things, the atmosphere, the story, the other characters on the screen were kind of, I felt were like these empty shells, and it just didn't have any traction to me outside of the shocking gore and violence in that film. There wasn't really a story. There really wasn't any people on screen outside of Art the Clown that I had empathy towards or that I really cared about. It just felt like a fast food kind of experience where it was delicious and kind of satisfying at first, but then the next day I was just like, didn't want to see it. So I kind of felt that way with that movie. And with Smile, I my reaction was not as extreme, but I think this film, like again, I think it had all these great traits. But the problem that I had with it is that it was so similar to this really good film here, It Follows, which I'm going to talk about today. And, it also had similarities to, I've heard it compared to, and I can kind of understand it and see it, but the Gore Verbinski's remake of The Ring, which I'm not a big fan of. I think that movie is not a very good movie. I think it's very overly hyped. I do love the Japanese version that it was based on. I think that movie is very suspenseful and very creepy and incredibly atmospheric, and there's a really good suspenseful element to it that I feel the remake that Gore Verbinski made it totally doesn't have. But I've heard that this film, or I should say, Smile, those are two films that it was very much. A lot of people said that it reminded them of, and especially It Follows. And for me, that's what it was. It really was the central piece of that story of Smile was that it was centered on this kind of faceless, evil entity that basically the way it was used in the story, which was the core of the story, was that it was used in this way that it would be transmitted from person to person and making these people do these, murderous things on the way. But it was basically that transference of this energy or this power from one person to the next, and that there was these rules kind of set in that universe and how a person could maybe get rid of this spirit or this like presence that captures them. And I couldn't help but think, after watching Smile, and especially when I was, halfway into the film, that it was directly, kind of, well, it might be a strong word, but I felt like it was literally the same story, and I couldn't get my head out of it. It took me out of the movie. I'm a big fan of It Follows, and it just totally, every time I kept seeing that, or that reference, I it took me out of the story, because, and I felt, well, it was not a very original idea. And the other thing about that film, about Smile, was the overuse of jump scares. I thought it relied a little bit too much on that. It was good at first. There's generally some really scary moments about that film, but it was overused. And I think the ending was very disappointing. I thought the ending, there were like these two weird, or one ending that felt pretty conclusive, pretty decent, not great, but fair and pretty good. And then there was suddenly this other ending that was tacked on that I felt really was super cliche. It was good, but it was super cliche and just so, I don't know. It just felt like it was an easy way out, and it felt like it was tacked on last minute. And so by that point, I was not invested in the movie, and I had a mixed thing about the film. And I've talked a lot about films that, along the lines, say, of newer horror films that, and again, I don't think a film, to be good, has to be, really, filled with all of this, it doesn't necessarily, for a film to be good, it doesn't have to be, super fresh and innovative and just, you know, uh, something like you've never seen before. It doesn't have to have, that kind of grandiose thing. Original content is obviously really, really great. But I think, I talked about that before, where I love slasher films. That's my favorite genre, and there's a very specific kind of set of characteristics that make up a slasher film. And I named off a bunch of films, and most of the films I cover are exploitation films, and by nature and by definition of exploitation, there's films that are going to be ripping off other films. One example is, say, Steven Spielberg's Jaws. Really, just an incredible movie. But in the exploitation world, that movie was grossly ripped off in many ways. Two examples is like Maniac, Bill Luswig's Maniac, which is my favorite slasher film of all time, completely ripped off of Jaws, and also The Car, another movie from the 70s that came out a couple of years after. But at the same time, those movies have their own charm to them, and they have their own voice, and they're totally rip-offs of that movie, but I feel, and you see that, but it goes into its own territory, and I find, even in the exploitation world, which typically doesn't have the highbrow, quote unquote highbrow production value that bigger Hollywood films have. They tend to have a smaller budget. The acting caliber isn't as high. So a lot of times they don't even use people who have any acting experience. Um, Things are very limited as far as how long they can shoot a film. But I still feel like those films have a certain grittiness and a certain quality. And those examples that I used, Jaws being ripped off by those two iconic films, two of my favorite, exploitation movies, they still have their own kind of voice. They're independent of it. They're not clones of it, like the story. They take the essence, but they do something different. And that's what makes those films special for me. And I feel like Smile didn't really do that. I felt like it basically copied. Like, I often think, this movie, Smile, for instance, had a huge budget. It was released by Paramount Pictures, a major, major blockbuster studio. And I kind of often think like, I wonder what goes on in the heads of the filmmakers and the executives when they're, sitting around in their lavish boardrooms, drinking their fancy drinks or eating their fancy meals. What goes through their head as far as how they decide to greenlight something? Like on one hand, they're presenting this film to a good director who is a quality director and but didn't have any experience, and it has this high production value. It has all of these things, but I felt like, isn't there anybody in that group of, say, those executives that that know about horror films, older films and newer films, and especially newer films, that that idea that would come up so quickly that, oh wait, this really reminds me of this movie that came out a few years back that was really innovative and fresh at the time, but but this new thing that we're going to greenlight, the story, the core principle of it, of the film, the centerpiece, is exactly the same thing. And we have all of this, but we also have all of this money riding on this project, and it's getting green. It's got the go ahead, the green light to be released, in a big theatrical campaign. So I would imagine that when they see that there's that big discrepancy, that they would be like, well, no, maybe something else needs to be fleshed out here. Maybe we shouldn't take that risk. So it's always funny to me, and it's not a, and I think that if you're a fan of movies, like, you're just aware of that. So I just wonder like what goes on in their heads when they're sitting around making these decisions. But so because I talked about Smile, I wanted to talk about It Follows. I think it always happens. It comes up a lot where there are people that come out, critics and whatnot. It happens in music too, where people always say, well, there's not any really good, fresh ideas that are coming out. One guy in particular who I've talked about, I really respect him, but I think he is overly critical. He's too cynical, and I feel like he trashes newer films, and he doesn't acknowledge that there are some really great directors right now in the filmmaking world, and particularly in the horror film world. And he basically, you know, dismisses all of these guys and girls that are directing some really fabulous movies, and it paints. And he has a lot of clout. He's a big figure in the world of film, and it gives this, or it puts everything in, or it puts this black cloud over everything. And I don't think he's very fair. But he typically says nothing new that comes out is very good, and that, and he just trashes basically every film that comes out. And I think someone like him, he's entitled to his opinion, but I think someone like him, Chris Gore, who's, very smart, very articulate, he he I think he's a figure because he has so much clout. I think he can affect people's habits and keep people, say, from going to the theater because they listen to what he says. So, and I don't agree with that at all. I think there has been some incredible movies, like, say, within the last few years, the last 2 or 3 years, and within this last year, as far as newer films, and especially with the horror genre, that have been really great, and they're all really diverse. And there's a pool of talent out there with directors that I think is kind of extraordinary right now. And again, I always go back to the old school. I'm an old school guy. I'm an old fart, and I always go back to the old school stuff. Movies and music from the '70s, early '80s, and '60s. Like, that's my jam. That's my, I don't know if you want to call it, but that's like my fountain of youth. Like, that's what I go back to. That's where, that's my favorite. Those are my favorite decades. But I still acknowledge that there's like some incredible things coming out right now. For example, uh, Hereditary, uh, The Northman, The Black Phone. The Invisible Man, X, Pearl. Right there is like 5 or 6 movies I can think of right off the top of my head that are all just incredible movies, I feel. And you have directors like Ari Aster, Robert Eggers, you have Ty West, some extraordinary talent make some of these guys that are just so incredibly talented that are making incredibly, original movies. And they all like have their own voice. They all have their own sound. They all have their own new thing that they're presenting, and they all have their own style. You can see their influences, but it's their own thing. They're all of just those films that I named on top of my head. Those are all new films, brand new films for the most part, but they all have their own voice. They all have their own kind of uniqueness to it, and they do something different within the genre of horror. And I would say that they're definitely all horror films or have elements of horror. But I think that group of films they're all like incredibly well crafted films. And another Ari Aster movie, Midsummer, terrific movie. And I put It Follows also in that list. I think again it was when this film first came out, like say like I talked about Ari Aster and Hereditary, and then like Midsummer or Robert Eggers, The Witch, or The Lighthouse, great example, were super innovative, super interesting, and totally original. Like I always feel like when I see one of a Robert Eggers film or an Ari Aster film, it's it's always new and it's always giving you new ideas and doing something different within the genre. I feel like it takes the horror genre and filmmaking for that for in general, but it takes the horror genre and kind of propels it and pushes it forward and makes it very contemporary. And I think genres need that. Genres need to have respect. The genres need to have there's always going to be you know certain figures within that genre that are really respected, but they're also looked at as pioneers. And what they tend to do is they push those genres forward so it can still move on to new things and it won't get stagnant and stale. And I feel like those guys are examples of that. And I feel like It Follows is part of that group. Again, it came out, it was unlike any other film of its time. And I feel even now, I haven't really seen a film like that. It's hard to believe it came out in 2014. It was directed by David Robert Mitchell, and it was also written by the same guy, David Robert Mitchell. And it was only made for like a million, basically $2 million, which is just nuts. And the cast is just extraordinary. Malcolm Monroe, Keir Gilchrist, Lily Seepy, Jake Wary, Olivia Lucardi, Daniel Zavodi. And this film, again, was so incredibly creepy and so incredibly innovative. The idea that there's this, kind of evil presence that you're not really sure. It's very ambiguous, but it transmits itself through sex, and it takes over this person and eventually kills them, and it's transmitted through acts of intimacy. That idea and concept I thought was so interesting and unique, and it really dove heavily into the idea of paranoia, and that you could run and run and run and run away from this force, but it eventually catches you. And it got away from the thing of, say, like the typical monster or typical slasher thing of where any moment you could get killed, in a quick way or a fast way. But this gave it, the way the setup of the story was so, I feel was so interesting, was that everything was done in a slow pace, and you could always sense that something was coming or see it in the distance, but knowing that if it caught you or caught up to you, you could be killed. And it just gave it even more of a sense of dread. And the cinematography, I bought this on Blu-ray pretty recently. I believe it was like a couple of years ago I bought it. And this is an incredible Blu-ray experience. I think it's one of the best horror Blu-rays out there as far as the picture, the sound. Seeing it in this format is just it's an experience. I would have loved to have seen this film in in the theater, but I was pretty late to the game when I eventually saw this movie. I remember hearing about it back, and it's hard to believe it came out in 2014. Um, but I remember hearing a lot about it, and then eventually I rented it on DVD, and I saw it on DVD for the first time, and I was generally creeped out. I was really blown away by how original it was, how suspenseful it was, how it had a real kind of retro 80s horror vibe, but yet it was very, very modern. And the cinematography was incredible. The cast was great. It was a very unique movie, a very unique horror experience. Um, and again, and I put it on, I would put It Follows in that same list that I just mentioned as far as newer, more modern, contemporary horror films that I feel all have a voice and they're all pretty fantastic. And I feel like It Follows is definitely one of those movies. One of the best things about this film is the soundtrack. The music for this film is just kind of bananas. The first time I heard it, the music is such a part of this film that I feel like it acts like its own character. And it really, really creates a mood and a vibe and an aesthetic. And the music was composed by Disaster Piece, or AKA Rich Vreeland, who's an electronic artist. And there's a pretty interesting documentary. It's not, or a special features section on the DVD. It's not very long, which is a little bit disappointing, but it's actually really good in a lot of ways because they do kind of more so centered on the music part of it and the film score, which I thought was interesting, and it was obviously something that really appealed to me because again I think it's a soundtrack and film score that I think would be something that would be great to own because I feel like it's such the music is just so haunting and disorienting and it's super creepy, but it's got this, and it's all like electronic based, but it just creates such a cool vibe. Um, just just really great. Um, and it really acts as a character. So I feel like it's definitely a film or a film score that I would love to own, like buy it on CD. And again, there's a little like I mentioned a few minutes ago. There's not a lot of special features on here, but there's a little like basically a mini interview with the director David Robert Mitchell, and he talks about how he discovered the the guy he hired, the person who ended up doing the music, and I guess his background was in the video game world. And the director was an avid, I guess a super, is a super like hardcore gamer, and he fell in love with a you know particular group of games, and he discovered this guy who was the composer, Rich Vreeland, and he was the creator of a lot of these movie or soundtracks for a lot of these games, and he hired him to do the film for It Follows. So it's very interesting, and I believe it was Rich Vreeland's first score for a theatrical movie, and interesting. And I think it's interesting that he came out of the video game world. But yeah, I can't recommend this movie enough. I think it's totally unique, totally original, gives you something new. It has, you know, like I said, I think it has a real classic kind of 80s vibe to it, particularly because of the music. The music has a little bit of an 80s dark wave kind of vibe to it, but it's such a cool movie and such a. It's got some moments in it that are generally creepy as all hell and scary. And there's a level of paranoia to this film that is pretty much through the roof. That and it's so suspenseful. It doesn't have the typical paint by numbers jump scare kind of scenario. So, but when you do get those jump scares and you do get those surprises of those, of that, that monster behind the door, it's pretty electrifying. And the film relies so heavily on just building the suspense and the characterization. Like you care about these group of kids that are going through this hell. And yeah, just such an awesome movie. It follows. Yeah, 2014. I highly recommend this film. A movie that I feel is loved by a lot of people, but I feel like as far as new horror films, isn't really talked about enough by people. And I think it's kind of been forgotten about. And I think it needs to be talked more about. And I think it needs to have a little bit more of. I think it needs more accolades. People talking about this film as being, especially when it first came out, just unlike anything else. So this is Jason Dean. Thanks again, and if you like this channel, please, like and subscribe to my crazy videos and my channel here at Film Fanatic. Really appreciate the love, and we will see you next time. Peace.